and welcome to a slightly different episode from the studio. Today we are joined by Skewb Climate's very own Jools Aspinall, and we are going to be talking all things obsessive compulsive disorder. Jules, a very warm welcome to you over my shoulder today.
Hi, thanks for having me, and sorry I couldn't be there in person.
That's okay. I kind of like you joining like the Wizard of Oz over my shoulder. So today we're going to be talking all things obsessive compulsive disorder. Uh, this is a condition that you experience and have lived experience of. So just for a bit of a backstory, first of all, for Skewbers, what are we talking about when we talk about OCD?
OCD, it's a mental health condition. So it's a lot of people think it's one thing, but it's quite complex. So it's you get unwanted recurring thoughts, which can be um really horrendous. They're things that you don't believe you as a person should be able to have, or should have. They're referred to often as compulsions, and they can start for any particular reason. They can be about anything. They can be so random, and they can be very graphic. They can be very violent. They can be very intrusive, and then that would lead to anxiety. Of course, you're having these absolutely horrendous thoughts. You can get anxious. You can get distressed. And then what this often leads to is the thing that I think people mostly recognize about OCD is certain behaviors that become repetitive as kind of a way of trying to control the uncontrollable. So you can't control the thoughts, you can't control the anxiety or the distress. So you start to exhibit recurring behaviors that you feel are helping control the situation. So not fun.
Yeah, it's quite a dark side to it, really, when actually there's quite a lot of jokes and misconception around OCD, but we'll get into that a little bit further down. So, we mentioned that you have lived experience. Do you mind just talking us a bit through your own experience of OCD and the diagnosis process?
Yeah, so I'll start with the diagnosis process. I've lived with this for as long as I can remember. Even being a small child, I had my earliest memories are kind of from when I was like 5 or 6, and I didn't go until I was in my late to mid 30s, let's say mid 30s. I went to see someone because I was going through a really tough time in my life. I was going through a lot of personal problems, and I went to go and speak to someone, and through that process I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. They then started to help me with cognitive behavioral therapy, so CBT, which I didn't find that worked well for me, but I can imagine that it does work for a lot of people. So, and it's one of those things throughout life where it's ebbs and flows. Sometimes I suffer from it. It's crippling, and sometimes I'll have periods of time, years, where it doesn't really affect me. So day to day, it can be a real struggle. When I was younger, it used to exhibit in a lot more of the more obvious behavioral, like repetitive behaviors. So I would be someone that had to check the light switches, the taps, um the plug sockets like 4 or 5 times before I left a room. I had to do it in a certain order. I had to do it in like a certain number of times. I've gone through phases where it's been around having things placed in a certain way. Again, another thing that I think is really common when people think of OCD is like having things in such an order. I've gone through things where it's meant like obsessively cleaning. So throughout the stages of my life, it's actually demonstrated itself in very different ways. But it can be, like I say, it's very distressing. It can be really, really hard to deal with, and it can be quite crippling at times because you're having these thoughts, you can't really explain why, and if I'm honest, to try and explain them to individuals is you don't it's not something you want to do because you kind of I've personally have felt shame around having some of these thoughts, so you don't really want to go sharing them. So it can be quite a lonely experience as well.
And there's a lot of misconceptions around it, which must add to the frustration. We were talking about this before the recording that people have a tendency to say, "Oh, sorry, that's just my OCD," but actually don't have OCD. What are
Yeah.
some of your frustrations around those misconceptions as someone who lives with it?
To be honest, I think there's so many things out there. I like to think people aren't doing it to be hurtful. It's just one of those things. It's caught on people say OCD, it's caught on, there's not a real understanding, and so they use those terms. It is, I think like everything, when you're going through an episode of it, you find it harder to deal with because you're kind of like, oh, if only you knew that it's not just I need my pencil to be in a straight line next to my notepad. It's a lot more than that. So it's a frustration, I think, that there's a frustration about the flippancy, but equally it's understandable. It's it's not something that's often talked about OCD other than kind of on a bit of a casual level. So a lot of people don't have an understanding. And I was thinking actually about this before we started chatting. I remember, I think it was in the like early noughties. It was either like Home and Away or Neighbours covered a story about OCD, which I mean, even now I don't think there's many soaps that have. And it was the obsessive hand washing, which I think is quite a commonly depicted kind of version of an OCD behavior. And I feel like they covered it to a point where they kind of gave it an explanation, but it manifested just as the hand washing. So then people were like, oh yeah, that's just what you do. You become obsessive about cleanliness, but actually they didn't delve into what OCD really was. And so I think whilst it's great that it gets talked about, sometimes that's also not helping with the misconception of what it is.
Yeah. And that's why it's so important to have people share their lived experience, which is why we're so grateful to you for speaking about this, because it just shines a completely different spotlight on the condition that people wouldn't even be aware of. So thank you, first of all, for even joining us today and talking about it. In terms of Skewbers and steps they can take, advice, support, how can we best support someone if we know or suspect they are experiencing OCD?
So what I would say is if it's like a suspect, don't kind of diagnose them, let them come to you. I think that's always, it should be the individual first. I would just say it's communication. So if someone has, openly told you that they suffer from OCD, checking in with them so every so often to make sure they're okay. Um, Everyone's experience of it, lived experience of it, is going to be different to mine. So you can't really again assume that what I've said is going to be the same for everybody else. Obviously, to an extent, it will be because it is a condition. But I think it's just keeping comms open and like chatting to people, and again, that like don't diagnose someone. But if you notice that they're doing something repetitively, again, just as you would as a normal person, check in, make sure they're okay. And yeah, I just think it's about chatting to people, and like say, if there are people that are out there that are willing to openly talk about it, have conversations with them. I'm more than happy to chat to people if they want to talk to me about it. um if they just want a better understanding, I'm always there. Love a question.
So we've talked about the importance of having those conversations, but once you get a diagnosis, can you share a bit more about your personal experience as to how you shared that with people around you? Like, how do you broach that conversation with loved ones, colleagues, anyone to say, hey, I have OCD?
Yeah, so I think again, this is going to be really different for each individual person. I am a bit of an open book. I'm happy to chat about these things. I haven't always been that way. One thing I will say is, as I mentioned, I wasn't diagnosed until I was in my mid 30s, and I think a lot of it has come with age and just being more confident in myself, and so being more confident to speak about these types of things. I also think that as I've got older, I've seen the world change, and it's much more accepting to talk about these things. We have things like this where people talk about it openly in work, which maybe didn't happen 10, 20 years ago. So I think all of that has helped me to be much more open and honest about it. I think it has to go on an individual basis, right? Not everyone's going to have the support network around them. Not everyone's going to have the people like we have at work or people at home that they can discuss it with. So what I would say is, if somebody does try and broach a conversation like this with you, you don't need to know everything about the topic. You don't need to know anything about it. But I just be open and supportive, and let somebody come to you in their own time and discuss it how they want to, without being too pushy, or asking questions is fine, but maybe again just gauging that situation and understanding how, maybe trying to understand how that person feels. And if you think it took a lot for them to come to you, maybe not asking a million questions at once. I know I'm always guilty of that. So just having a think about how they might feel just telling you to start with. But yeah, sorry, it's a bit long-winded, but that's kind of my view on that one.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to have that conversation with us today and for sharing your experiences. We really, really appreciate it, for shining a different light on OCD. And if you want to find out more about life with OCD, from treatments to symptoms, just head to the charity Minds website. Thank you very much for joining us today, Jools.
Thank you.